The spooky time is over. The skeleton wars will never end, but the time for them, the month, is over. So, let's talk about what I read in this month. Hello, I'm Pete. This is the Ponderings of Pete. I talk about books. I talk about fantasy. I talk about sci-fi. I talk about nonfiction sometimes. And I think I'm funny. I usually post videos every Monday and every Friday. And yeah, if you like this video, give it a like. If you want to subscribe, please do, and hit that bell notification. Because even though YouTube notifications are trash, that kind of helps a little bit. As you can tell, I did kind of go as like a steampunk, mad scientist, inventor thing for my whatchamacadoodle Halloween costume this year. Did not decide to put it all on, even though in hindsight that probably would have been a better idea, but work. So, let's talk about what I read in October. First off, for a bit of a spooky read, or just October read, October Country by Ray Bradbury, one of my favorite authors. This is a book of short stories written by Ray Bradbury. A lot of them are, there's a few of them that are October themed. There's one about a kid who lives with a family of just irregulars. Which by irregulars, I mean supernatural creatures. Some of them are telepathic, some of them are werewolves and stuff like that. Really cute story. And there's one about a guy who basically thinks his skeleton is killing him. So yeah, there's some really interesting stories in here. I had a lot of favorites. There Was a Woman, for certain. The Skeleton is also a favorite of mine. And there were a few others I can't... Let's just look through the table of contents first. Skeleton? Yes. The Small Assassin was really creepy. Jack in the Box was a very interesting concept. The Scythe was great. The Man Upstairs was also very interesting and kind of like, wow, kid, okay. There Was an Old Woman, again, my favorite, absolutely. And then The Wonderful Death of Dudley Stone was definitely my second favorite, besides There Was an Old Woman. And they kind of like, I feel like they could switch with previous, just because the message of The Death of Dudley Stone was phenomenal. So yeah, check this out. Check out Ray Bradbury short stories in general. They're really good. They're really short. They're nice cleansers, because like you read a long book, read a few short stories. They're different. They're great. Next one I'm going to talk about, I've talked about before. I actually finished it in October technically, but I talked about it more on my September wrapped up, and that was The Dust of Dreams. I also have a video that's like semi-coherent ramblings, I think I called it, because I talked about a lot of the stuff that I got in Dust of Dreams. Short summary, it's not as bad as people think, in my opinion, and I'm in the middle of The Crippled God right now, so yeah, that's all I'm going to say about that. Next up is one I also had a live show for, and that is the Gulag Archipelago. I had a live show with Christy and Gregory. We talked about gulags, we talked about depressing things, there was torture, and there's some interesting graphic stuff in this. This is just volume 1, which we've read. We're going to be reading volume 2 and having more live shows in the future. This was interesting on two different levels. One, the historical level. The accounts aren't necessarily completely accurate, because likely. First of all, because he lists the author lists a lot of numbers, and those numbers aren't necessarily supported by other sources. For instance, the amount of people that were arrested in a certain year, he listed as like, yeah, a quarter of Moscow was arrested. It's like, no, the numbers don't necessarily support that we know of yet, because there's a lot of fluffy stuff with Russian documents, Russian documentation. I mean, every time I look through documentation, or look for documentation, or stories about historians going through documentation, a lot of stuff has survived because essentially Moscow told them to burn stuff and they didn't burn stuff. So there was definitely some documentation erasure by the USSR and even the Russian government to a certain extent, from what I can tell. So a lot of the records are incomplete. There are archives that have only recently been opened or that still haven't been opened from the USSR period. So Russian history around the time of the Cold War is murky. So this is an excellent book to read about the conditions of the Gulag, because this is a lot of collected works. Well, it's written by the author based on his own experience and based on hundreds of letters that he received from people about their experiences. So I think in the essence, the calling it accurate regarding the Gulag experience, I think that's there's a lot of truth there. So that was horrifying. The other level that this is interesting is the literary level, because there's a lot of talk about whether it's the psychology of people, the psychology of the specific cops that were involved with this, the specific people that were capturing, specific people that were doing the interrogations, and just like how they got to where they're at. And so it's an interesting look at how to write mind games, how to write just not necessarily torture, because he's very clinical about torture. When he writes it, he's just like, oh yeah, they did this. And he lists different torture methods in a specific chapter. But it's a very interesting look at writing horrible things that can be taken inspiration from, because honestly, fact is stranger than fiction a lot of the times. And if somebody were to write a fictional account of this and put that in their book without reading anything that was, not in it from another book, and came up with a lot of these torture methods or whatever, I'd be concerned for them a lot, because there's some disturbing stuff. So yeah, it's good from an idea perspective, because I don't think I could come up with half of this stuff without completely going mad. The next book was a buddy read, and that was Legion by Brandon Sanderson. Buddy reading this with Gregory LaPerche over on his Discord channel. Check it out. At some point, we're going to do a live show when he gets finished with the book. If he ever finishes the book, because Greg doesn't really read anyways, so it's kind of like, whatever. We are going to do a live show for this little-known Sanderson book about a guy who has hallucination, or basically the way his brain processes stuff is it makes up personalities that are requilaries. It's just where information is stored. So in terms of accessing information that he knows about, he accesses it through people, personalities. Really interesting look at a mental state. Essentially, one theme of Sanderson sometimes is, or a lot of the times, is psychology as superpowers. So this is like a very direct, in-depth look at that. I really enjoyed it. The next book that I read on Halloween night and the day before, and that was The Halloween Tree by Ray Bradbury. Great, just October read in general. It talks about the origins of Halloween in a very, children's. This feels like a really good children's story, like Christmas Carol type children's story. Minus the Dickens being, if Dickens decided to make Christmas Carol not so wordy because he was paid by the word count, and made it about Halloween, this might be something along these lines. I really like this book as a Halloween read. So yeah, disturbing, but also Halloween. Next one, been consistent on my TBR for a few months, and that is Fred, the Vampire Accountant, Book 3, Bloody Acquisitions. Previously, the last few books of Fred, the books have been very contained in the sense that the books have been very short story method. So a lot of the different stories, they're in chronological order, but they're definitely a lot separate. And the different stories are starting to become more connected and have a solid storyline between them in this book, which I really liked, because we're seeing Fred and his family kind of adjust to, his found family specifically, kind of adjust to changes in the environment, and we're getting a little bit more into supernatural politics, which is really cool. Not like really, really in depth, because this is a comedy. This is a funny book. It's not about really in-depth politics, but we're getting a little bit of that, which is cool. Another buddy read that I started last month, but I'll talk about, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. You probably saw this on my November TBR, and I said a few things. This book is really good. I love the writing style. I have thoughts. I want to do a video on it, but I won't do that video until I finish in December, probably. Lots of thoughts. It's definitely, I really love, like, it's in the Napoleonic era, so you're starting to have a little bit of guns, but you don't see them because you're more concentrate. You're more the perspective is more focused on the social life back in England as magic comes back into the world, brought by Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. It's also fun to see the alternative history that is presented here, where it's talked about like, hey, yeah, the Raven King was super integral in this point in history. It's like, wow, there's a completely different history to England because of magic. And I'd love to explore that more. Just such a unique and interesting setting. It reminds me of my childhood in good ways, like with growing up with Arthurian legends and stuff like that, and like just fairy tales. It takes that and really applies them to this Regency era England and takes just a lot from that mythology, which is really, really good to see this go back to the roots of fantasy in this way. Next up, another buddy read, Blood of the Mantis by Adrian Tchaikovsky. I recently did a live show about this with Alan on Alan's channel, along with Average Joe and Andrew's Wizardly Reads. We had a lot of fun discussing this. I had a lot of thoughts about this because I think this book, there were definitely some of my critiques about the series really is, I realized them in this book. I like this book better than the second one. In its own way, I think the second one's sieges were great. This one did not have any. But we got some air warfare here that was really exciting for me. But the setup and payoff of this book was still kind of just like, the payoff was lacking, in my opinion, on some of the storylines in this book. Book 3, Shadows of the Apt. Not going to keep talking because then I'll spoil things more than I probably already did. Check this series out. It's about a war in a place, a fantasy world where a lot of like the magic is based on insects. And there's like a hard magic and more of a soft magic. The hard magic is what's known as art, where different races of humans are able to access different magic powers, specific magic powers, in order to do things. But it's not called magic, it's art. Magic and art are completely separate things. There's also this otherworldly magic, not otherworldly, but like softer, more fantasy, like more classical fantasy magic that is only able to be used by the non-apt, but the apt races, or apt humans, also are able to use technology, whereas the non-apt races cannot really use technology that much. So there's a lot of interesting dynamics, there's a lot of interesting world building, and yeah, so we're kind of getting into like either a semi-steampunk flintlock time period, which is really, really cool. And the final book is a graphic novel that I just randomly picked up and I was like, oh, this is cool. I'm gonna keep going. And that is Sandman by Neil Gaiman, illustrated by Sam Keefe, Mike Dringenberg, and Malcolm Jones III. This was interesting. I'm not typically a graphic novel guy. There are very few. I have very few. I picked this up because I saw it in the store that I was at, the game store, the local game shop that I was at, and I was like, you know what, I've heard some that this is really good, so I'm going to start it. A lot of connections to actual like DC comics, like the DC superhero universe, which I didn't expect to begin with. It's also getting a Netflix adaptation, so that kind of put this a little bit on my radar. Starts out with a cult trying to summon death, which was okay, cool. But they don't get death. They get death's younger brother, Sleep. So, and chaos ensues. I can definitely see some places where the show can take a lot of liberties because there's some time gaps and like, hey, these things happen, but they don't really cover them that much in this book. So I'm interested in seeing where the show might go, maybe. I was very kind of surprised by the mature stuff in here. I was expecting DC Comics. I was expecting something more kid-friendly, but it wasn't as kid-friendly as I thought it was. So yeah, this is definitely a more mature side of comic books. The whole like, oh, comic books aren't made for kids. This will probably be one that would be listed in such a conversation. I need to read more to get a good idea. And I don't have much of an idea what's like great for comic books. So I'm kind of curious in seeing how far I'll get with this. Cool. And that's everything. That's all. That's everything I read, which is like 6 or 7. I think 7 is probably around my average anyways, which is good. I've started building TBRs that are bigger than my reading speed, but that's just a thing of BookTube. So that's what I read in November, spooky month. If you would like to get any of these books, I will try to have affiliate links down below, which means I get a small portion of the profits. Really cool. Bookshop is trying to become a not-for-profit Amazon alternative, so please consider like shopping there if you can. Just don't shop at Amazon. That's all I ask. Because I'm not a big fan of theirs because of their toxicity in the book market. We should make a video about that one day. I'll talk to you later. Get some rest. That is super important.